Welcome to this episode of Business Battleground. Today we're going to ask why now? Why are the Google co-founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, deciding to step down now in December of 2019? So, these are two guys who, while at Stanford, launched a project called Backrub that went on to become one of the most valuable businesses of all time. Today it's called Alphabet. We'll talk about that. Interestingly enough, when the two met each other at Stanford on the first day, legend has it that they didn't even like each other. But they were smart enough to realize that together they could make a great combo. They raised money from two of the leading Silicon Valley firms, venture capital firms, namely Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia. And legend has it that Yahoo offered to buy Google for I think something like $1 billion. Google countered with $2 billion. Yahoo balked. And subsequently, kind of boneheaded decision, Yahoo decided to feature the Google search engine on its portal when Yahoo remained one of the largest trafficked websites. From then, the dot-com bubble burst, the NASDAQ crashed down to earth, display advertising dried up, and of course, while still private, Google went on to build one of the most fantastic businesses of all time and arguably the best advertising business ever. Advertising is like a $500 billion industry, and Google's search is positioned to take a lot of ad dollars away from already from print, newspapers, and magazines, and slowly but surely, especially with the acquisition of YouTube, from television as well. What made them so successful? Two things. Two things in particular. I would say the technology, obviously. When Google came around, it was the 13th search engine. It wasn't the first, but it was arguably the best, and best is a relative terms when it comes to quality. Something we also talk about when it comes to the video industry. Quality is a subjective term, I guess. As well as the people. If you're interested more about why Google went on to dominate the industry, I suggest you take a look at our Perfect Storm video in a previous Business Battleground episode where we actually break down over 10 reasons why. So the link is below in the comments. But ultimately, for this context episode, we're going to talk about the technology and mainly the people. So early on, Google wisely hired my paisano, Omid Kordestani, who had been an executive at Netscape, amongst other companies. And Omid was arguably one of the first guys to really get what the business could look like. And he was given carte blanche to basically build up the business as Sergey and Larry were building up the technology. They also hired a lot of brilliant people, and there's that famous Steve Jobs quote that says, quote, "A players hire A players, B players hire C players, and C players hire D players. It doesn't take long to get to Z or Z players. The trickle-down effect causes bozo explosions in companies," end quote, which is definitely a Steve Jobs sounding like quote, or a Steve Jobs-like sounding quote. In any case, along with other great hires, they also hired this software technology executive named, of course, Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt had some successes, some failures, and ultimately had been beaten up by Microsoft amongst pretty much any other executive that had not worked at Microsoft in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So he kind of had this desire to beat Microsoft, and wisely, he recognized that in Google, he found this technology, this essentially cloud-based, before that was a term, software that was far superior to anything out there. And this is at a time when, Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, had almost written off the internet and definitely was not interested in the World Wide Web or search. And when Eric Schmidt joined Google, it was an interesting example of how the founders of a technology company, kind of stepping aside, could coexist and grow a business with a bit less friction than, say, when a John Sculley, a marketer, was parachuted into Apple to work alongside Steve Jobs, and that was not going to last. So Eric was kind of seen as the adult in the room, allowing Larry and Sergey to kind of play with the technology and do what they were best at. And frankly, that worked for all intents and purposes. And going back to that Steve Jobs quote, Google kept hiring A players, and I have a lot of contacts at Google, working 20 years in the online media industry. And the first 5, I actually started my career in search. So we got Googled, when I was at Mama, a meta search engine that was actually, pretty big for its, at the time. Google came on the scene and it was clear that they had a superior technology, but I started to kind of like meet people from Google. And then when I went to AskMen as an online publisher, we were there on ground zero when AdSense and AdWords launched, and I got to meet some extremely smart people. And incidentally, even when Google would would acquire companies like, say, Sprinks or Applied Semantics, they would basically almost make everybody reapply. And there's a reason why I'm giving this background, because ultimately it does explain why Larry and Sergey are leaving now, and it's quite telling about the era and the times we live in. But so whenever Google would buy a company, they were very strict with hiring. So it would be like you didn't only have to go to, like, let's say, a limited number of schools, but you also needed to do something else. I remember an employee who was there for over a decade telling me it wasn't enough that you went to Harvard, but you also had to be like the leading cellist at your high school. You weren't just like this brilliant programmer, but like you were like the chess master wizard of like your whole like state, right? So they were very selective in who they hired, and they kept adding really, really smart people, these so-called A players. Now these A players in another era would have been, curing polio and doing all these wonderful things. But at Google, ultimately, the best and brightest in America and eventually the world were figuring out and trying to entice users to click on ads, right? So that, I think, at the core is where you started to see this divergence of Google's do no evil mantra that Paul Buchwald, I don't even know how to pronounce that, but the inventor of Gmail kind of coined. But so you had this divergence of this do no evil and let's cure cancer versus, hey, let's get people to click on ads because we're going to make more money. And today, when you look at Google's or Alphabet's financials, which we'll get into in a second, what the hell is Alphabet? Alphabet, which is basically the parent company of Google, Alphabet of its $136.8 billion in revenue, 136.2, so all but 600 million comes from advertising. So Google, despite all its lofty ideals and everything it wanted to do, its vision, its mission, its statement of purpose, is ultimately hiring very smart people to get users to click on ads. That's what it boils down to, and there's no shame in that. But the point is that over the course of the years, Google is over 20 years old now, you had these two founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who basically did an IPO in 2003, I believe, and had to kind of like open up and expose their business to the universe. But because they needed to tap into the capital markets to get money to go out and reinvest in technology and acquire and hire more people, they still wanted to maintain control. So they basically had this dual share class structure where they owned a given level of stock that gave them all the power, and then shareholders would buy in and be able to get on this rocket ship to participate in the financial upside, but not have a say in how the business would be run. A precursor to what Mark Zuckerberg did at Facebook, but also Adam Neumann, of course, at WeWork in a more cautionary tale. But for all intents and purposes, it worked at Google. Sergey and Larry could kind of stay true to their ideals and build this business while Eric Schmidt, so again, Sergey and Larry could basically, stay true to their ideals while the adult in the room, the chaperone, Eric Schmidt, could kind of run the business. But eventually, times change. We now live in a world post-Me Too where you look at the very natural evolution of civil rights, human rights, where, the things that we now assume to be normal and fair, meaning black people should have the same rights, obviously, as white folks, and women who get the right to vote 100 years ago, it's crazy. Why didn't they have the right to vote in the first place? So if you fast forward to 2010s, you have this kind of two founders that have made far more money than, ungodly sums. They are worth $60 billion each to kind of quantify that. And you have their really idealistic, intelligent, intellectual, largely liberal, progressive workforce that has a certain ideal that is, frankly, nowadays more and more commonplace, rightfully, where the rights of women should not be stomped upon, and the LGBTQ constituency at Google has some valid concerns about where society is going and where the company is at with regards to the treatment of, the more downtrodden constituents of society. And to this day, you see what's happening in America, where the Me Too kind of movement just amplified and put a spotlight on that. But the shit that women and LGBT people have to put up with is still kind of shocking, right? So, and we've covered that, right? We've covered how Google could somehow both be one of the most admired places to work at, but yet be this place where, a lot of bad shit happens to them. And we've covered it. We'll put the links at the bottom. But to conclude, I think fundamentally what a lot of the YouTube and Google and Maps and Android and all these employees were hoping for was that once Google decided to kind of not break up, but elevate Alphabet as a holding company, this modern day Berkshire Hathaway, and say, we on top are this all-knowing, wise founders and, technical, brilliant brains, we're going to allocate capital and see what we should pursue in terms of solving the big challenges that mankind faces. It's a very altruistic thinking, and I think if they're going to be candid with themselves at the end of this decade, they're like, at the end of the day, all these other projects are nice, these moonshots, but Google remains a one-trick pony, and there's nothing wrong with that. I would love to have a pony, a stallion that generates $136 billion in revenue. But the point is, it still fundamentally needs all of its employees to be focused on how do you get users to click on ads. So Larry and Sergey, sitting on a net worth of $60 billion, are seeing two things. They're seeing this loud chorus of employees that basically want them to come down, back, descend upon earth, and say, we are here to right the ship. We hear that you employees are upset. We understand that you don't like that those who raise their voices are kind of fired or let go over dubious reasons. And we're here to right the ship, And when they look at that, I think they kind of just said, it's not for us. We're very lucky. We're very fortunate. Luck, timing, they're very intelligent. We don't need to put up with this much baggage and this much complaining, albeit some of it may be valid. So that's half of it. The second reason why I believe that they are basically deciding that it's time to ride into the sunset, you have to be living in a cave not to realize that aside from the first stakeholder, employees, the second stakeholder that is probably going to come and breathe very heavily down on Google's neck is the government. Whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, whether you are progressive or conservative, it doesn't matter. The reality is that big tech, Facebook, Google, Amazon in particular, Apple, even Netflix, just throw them all in the lot, they've accumulated a tremendous amount of power over governments' lack of insights, intelligence, familiarity, yada, 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 of how big tech operates. Big tech is the boogeyman in the room, and I think that a lot of people are still just waking up from the hangover that is the Donald Trump presidency and saying, hey, wait a second. Why are we in this position where America is ridiculed and all of a sudden America is playing second fiddle soon, if not already, to China, and where NATO is questioned? And you start adding list upon list as to why people may be unhappy with where America is, and it's very easy to blame Facebook and Amazon and Google. So I think if you are Sergey and Larry, you are at a point as this decade ends where you're saying, you know what? Sundar Pichai, who is the gentleman that in 2007 was a director in Google and within a decade became CEO of Google, is now ready to just take over the entire operation, including at the Alphabet level, because Google is Alphabet and Alphabet is Google. And as much as Google's ideals are, were, and shall remain, relatively speaking, lofty, I still think Google internally does believe that it is doing good. And I think they are a net positive in society. I just think when Sergey and Larry, given their vast fortune, sit back and look at the landscape going in 2020, they see users are happy with the products that they are given. They see marketers are really happy with the solution that they provide advertisers. And they also see Wall Street and shareholders extremely happy with the tremendous return that investors have received. But then when they look at the two constituencies that are basically employees and the government, they kind of see two dead ends. And if you're Sergey and Larry, and Eric Schmidt has ridden himself into the sunset, then Sundar's the guy. And this was a natural progression, and frankly, I'm just surprised that anybody is surprised by the turn of events.